Okay, so let's get going. All right, so the value add that, is this really loud, man? I'll stand back here. The value add that diversity brings to any organization is well documented. Firms of all sizes are looking for ways to add diversity to their workforce while simultaneously putting in place policies of inclusion that enable the intended goals to be achieved. Now, Heather Brilliant is President and CEO of Diamond Hill Asset Management. She's going to come up here and she's going to share her experiences on achieving cognitive diversity, a concept of ensuring that organizations have groups of people making decisions or solving problems who think about problem solving in different ways. Now, after Heather presents, she will be joined on the stage with Kate McAllister of Global Liquidity Partners and Julie Andress of KeyBank Capital Markets. Kate and Julie are both co-chairs of the STA Women in Finance Committee. We would also like to thank TradeWeb for sponsoring the STA Women in Finance effort this year. If your firm is interested in doing it next year, please contact us. Some more about Heather. So Heather Brilliant serves as the CEO and President for Diamond Hill Capital Management. It's an independent, active asset manager based in Columbus, Ohio, with significant employee ownership and over $30 billion in assets as of March 2021. Heather joined the firm in 2019, bringing more than 20 years of domestic and international investment industry experience to the role. Previously, Ms. Brilliant served as CEO Americas with First State Investors, and prior to that role, she spent 14 years with Morningstar, where she served as Global Head of Equity and Credit Research before advancing to CEO of Morningstar Australia Asia. Ms. Brilliant is a long-standing member of the CFA Institute, a global credential organization for the investment industry. She served on the board of the CFA Institute from 2013 to 2020 and was chair of the board from 2018 to 2019. And finally, I'll say that Heather is very active in her local community, serving on various charitable boards, including the Columbus Partnership, a nonprofit membership-based organization of more than 70 CEOs from the Columbus area, focused on improving the economic vitality of the Columbus region. So with that, it's my pleasure to bring up here Heather Brilliant.
Thanks, Jim, for that intro, and hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. It's amazing to actually see a conference happening in person. I think it's the first one I've seen go forward in quite some time. So I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to talk about the concept of cognitive diversity, as Jim mentioned. And before I dive into that, I thought I'd tell you a little bit of a story about my background. Now, Jim mentioned kind of the places I've worked and everything, and I think that is in your packet and is not super interesting in comparison. But what I do think is interesting is I get the question a lot: how did I, as a woman, become a CEO of a publicly traded asset manager in an industry that is very, frankly, male-dominated still to this day? And so the story I really wanted to share around that is about the importance of putting your hand up. And I actually think this really applies to anyone. It is not, it's not gender specific or really specific to any particular background, but just the idea of developing a sufficient level of confidence coupled with sufficient humility, but sufficient confidence to be able to say, I think I could try doing a role that perhaps I haven't done before or don't have exactly the experience to do. And that really is kind of how I ended up in this position. When I was at Morningstar, I was an equity analyst and researching companies, as many of you, I'm sure, have done at points in your career. And I really felt like I was not achieving my higher purpose. I felt like I could be so much more impactful, helping everyone else be successful as research analysts. And so I applied for a role that didn't even really exist by talking to my boss's boss and saying, hey, if you're ever thinking about maybe having someone run the equity research team that is perhaps independent from the person who is determining the equity research methodology, I'd be interested in talking about that. And it just so happened that they had been having that conversation. And so, taking the opportunity to really put myself out there made all the difference. And I mention this for a couple of reasons. First, this is a theme that has kind of run through a number of different positions I've had in my career. So I do think there really is something to putting yourself out there. But the second thing I wanted to mention about it is that it's very easy for everyone to see when you're looking at someone's resume or background, all of the roles that they actually got. But what you never see are all the roles that I did apply for that I didn't get. And I think that's really important for everyone to remember, and that goes to the humility piece, right? It's not like everybody who you might look at their background and say, oh, how did they accomplish that, or I'd like to achieve that. You're not ever looking at the whole story. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind as well. So let's turn a little bit to this concept of cognitive diversity. As Jim mentioned, this is something I've been really passionate about for a number of years. And I started out in this industry thinking, I can succeed in this industry, and so clearly there's nothing about it that holds women back because I'm a woman and I'm doing fine, and so anyone who really wants to succeed can do so too. And that was really my pretty tightly held belief for probably the first 15 years that I spent in this industry. And then all of a sudden, it was actually when I moved to Australia, I looked around and I said, wait a minute, if it is so easy for everyone who wants to succeed in this industry, why isn't it more diverse? And I started really asking a lot more questions and digging deeper into this topic of, are there some things that we could be doing differently or thinking about differently that could lead to the opportunity to have teams that look more representative of society, let's just say. And so I started getting really passionate about this topic, and I came across the work of an author named Scott Page. And Scott is a professor at the University of Michigan. He's written a couple of books on the idea of cognitive diversity. And essentially, I think you could define cognitive diversity as people who make decisions or solve problems in different ways with different approaches. So essentially, no one person can be diverse by this definition. It's really about the compilation of the group of people and how they come together and think about things differently, but in a way that can lead to some sort of consensus and outcome in decision making. So in one of his books, Scott Page, in the diversity bonus, defined it specifically as linking differences in information, knowledge, representations, mental models, and heuristics to better outcomes on specific tasks such as problem solving, predicting, and innovating. And interestingly, he does talk a lot about how if you are talking about very discrete, individually performed tasks, diversity is kind of irrelevant. You don't really get the benefit of having people work together and thinking through things in different ways. But if you are talking about innovation, solving problems, trading, all of the things that we struggle with on a daily basis as an industry, then frankly, the more you can make sure you're bringing diverse perspectives into the conversation, the more likely you are to come up with a more innovative solution or something that can really move things forward in a way that the tried and true doesn't always do. So why should you care about cognitive diversity? Well, I wanted to give you a couple of data points that I've come across in researching this topic. There was a report in the Harvard Business Review that cognitively diverse teams are more likely to solve a problem than non-diverse teams. They did a study where they kind of brought together different groups. Deloitte did a study that revealed that cognitively and demographically diverse teams can enhance innovation by 20% and reduce risks by up to 30%. Essentially, that bringing people with different backgrounds together leads to people seeing things that they might not have otherwise identified. So how exactly do cognitively diverse teams deliver these benefits? What is it about a diverse team that leads to a better outcome or a different outcome? There was actually another Harvard Business Review article that was authored by the Neuro Leadership Institute, which is a pretty interesting organization based out of New York that really studies the way the brain works and how this all comes together in terms of how people solve problems. And it was published in 2016, and it really focused on a few key things that cognitively diverse groups do differently. The first is that they focus more on facts. They're constantly re-examining the data and have a tendency to remain more objective. The second is that they process those facts more carefully. Specifically, the process of considering the perspective of an outsider requires them to kind of keep on questioning the underlying assumptions that they're making. And third, cognitively diverse groups tend to be more innovative. They avoid the pitfalls of conformity because they're not coming to the table with the same set of underlying assumptions. So hopefully that gives you some idea of why this topic has become so important to me. And I know when Julie and Kate come up here, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the examples that I've had in my background of being part of teams that are more or less cognitively diverse. The one thing I wanted to mention, too, before we turn to that part of our session, is that it really is possible for anyone to add to the cognitive diversity of a group. And so I think the challenge when you're, let's say, hiring someone to add them to your team is that it is very hard to know from an interview process whether you are adding someone that is going to add a meaningful amount of cognitive diversity. And so this is something also that Scott Page has talked a lot about, that in fact, looking at things like gender diversity and demographic diversity are good proxies for cognitive diversity. It's not perfect. It doesn't mean that you will always you will always get a more diverse team if you have a team that is gender balanced, for example. But it's far more likely than if you don't. So hopefully that gives you some concept of why this topic is so important from my perspective. And I'd love to have Julie and Kate come and join me up here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Heather, thank you so much for those insights. I'd love to hear about how cognitive diversity helped Diamond Hill to navigate through the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say one thing that we focused a lot on during the pandemic was over-communicating. And I think it's been really interesting, having just started at Diamond Hill 6 months before the pandemic, that I felt like I didn't really know everybody at a very deep level. And thank goodness we had those 6 months to at least understand the team to some extent. But once we all went to working from home, very suddenly, as we all remember, I felt it was really important to kind of find some people from different parts of the firm with different tenures in the organization and really ask, are we hitting the mark with what we're communicating? Do you feel like you have everything you need from us as an organization? And we actually went to a period of about 6 months where I sent either a video or an email or some kind of communication to our entire company every single day. And it was easy back then because there was just so much to talk about where people were wondering what's happening next, what is the governor of Ohio saying, since we are largely based in Ohio. And so we really tried to just kind of keep everybody on the same page. And back then, people responded so much. Like, people needed some human interaction, even if it was over video or email or Zoom. And so just kind of seeking all of those perspectives from different people on our team was a really helpful part of that process.
It kind of goes off of what I was going to ask in terms of with the pandemic and how teams and cultures have been affected with certain companies. So did you feel like that's something that you'll continue, or how do you think cultures and cognitive diversity will be going forward with the change in the workforce?
Well, what we're kind of seeing now that I'm sure many of you have experienced is that we now have some people who are eager to come back to the office and others who are not so eager. And we've decided to give people a lot of flexibility for the rest of this year. We always felt like as soon as we started working from home, things went pretty smoothly, so there's no reason why people can't work from home. That being said, 18 months plus into this, I do feel like you start to see some fissures from a cultural perspective. We are a 130-person organization, and we've hired probably 20 people during the pandemic. So those people have never experienced Diamond Hill in person. And I think that is something that will be increasingly challenging as time goes on. So we've been talking to our teams about, kind of encouraging people to pick a day or two of the week, try coming in. We're providing lunches a couple days a week to, encourage people to feel comfortable. And I think it's leading to a lot more positive experiences in the office, because when you come back to the office and you're one of 3 people in a space that can accommodate 100, it feels really strange, and it feels like you're working on a Saturday. And so we really did need to get to some kind of critical mass, I think, to start making it feel like the office culture was coming back.
So during your talk, you spoke about all the advantages of cognitive diversity, but can you ever have too much cognitive diversity in an organization?
I actually think you can in some ways, but it partially comes down to making sure you have the right frameworks to make decisions. The challenge, if you have too much diversity, is that you can, I think, lead to decision paralysis. Essentially, if everybody has completely different perspectives and you don't have a sufficient framework for constructive debate and discussion, then I think it can be really challenging to reach decisions sometimes. And so ultimately, I think this happens so rarely in our industry that it's not something I worry about too much. But I do see sometimes when you get to a group bigger than like 6 or 8, you need to be really clear about how the decision is going to be made and who has what decision rights in order to make sure that everyone understands their input is valued, but it might not be their final call or things like that.
Interesting. When it comes to, is that loud? When it comes to kind of hiring and how Diamond Hill looks at, especially being there for 2 years now, moving forward, how are you going to look at diversity in the hiring process? I mean, we've spoken about some of the other studies on biases and things when you're looking at education and affinity to cultural organizations, but is that something that when companies are targeting certain schools for hiring or certain backgrounds, is that something that keeps us away from cognitive diversity, or how do we kind of look at that in the hiring processes, different companies, and how does Diamond Hill look at it?
So ultimately, when I think about diversity in the hiring process, I think of the objective as making sure you're tapping into every potential audience of candidates. And so if you constantly recruit at the same places or focus on a narrow part of the field, or even just post your jobs and wait to see who applies, you're getting a pretty narrow perspective in terms of the potential talent out there for your roles. So what we have done at Diamond Hill is to really seek additional applicants in a variety of different ways by going to some different schools that we hadn't perhaps recruited at before, or to making sure that we have a diverse slate of candidates for our roles, to partnering with some organizations like Jopwell to try to make sure that we are attracting candidates who might not otherwise be aware of Diamond Hill, or even in some cases our industry. And so I think for us that has led to us having more applicants for roles and more talent to choose from. And I get this question a lot. Of course, ultimately, we always hire the person who is the most qualified for the role. But we do think about that qualification as how they add to our team. And not only, is this the best person? Is this the best person? Is this the best person? Because actually a team of best people does not always lead to the best outcomes. It's actually having those different perspectives that leads to the overall team being able to outperform.
So once you bring employees into Diamond Hill, I recently watched an interview that you gave on Business Brew where you spoke about the ownership program at Diamond Hill. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that's impacted employee engagement within the firm?
Sure. So we have a program or a policy of really trying to ensure that everyone who works at Diamond Hill has the opportunity to be an owner. And so we do that by providing an equity award as part of every new hire experience for every single role. And then we do also have an employee stock purchase plan where we try to kind of allow people to continue to increase their ownership, and a long-term incentive plan that is geared towards our employees, where they have the greatest opportunity to move the needle in terms of the long-term intrinsic value of the business. And all of those things, I think, really lead to a culture of long-term thinking, really thinking about the enterprise over time and people's ability to contribute to it, but also really leads to an ownership mentality. And sometimes ownership can lead to an ownership mentality and sometimes not. But I think in our case, what we're really focused on is giving people the autonomy to be able to make the right decisions for their role and to contribute to the future of the company and how we think about kind of innovation and problem solving. So I think it's been a huge positive. It's something that's really been part of Diamond Hill since the beginning for 20 plus years.
Seems like a great way to keep employees engaged. We were talking about this before in terms of with the change in the pandemic and the changes in the workforce, how there's different levels of different people of really wanting some appreciation and then wanting a different outcome from their jobs nowadays. We've all kind of shifted a mentality. So in terms of promoting, one thing we have been seeing too is companies are working on hiring diverse candidates, but then they're kind of stagnant. So is there any thoughts that you have around that of what people can do and what companies can be doing to make sure that you're not just including these people that might fit into a cognitive diversity group, but we're also engaging them to move forward and work and stay around in the companies and work harder?
Yeah. I think our industry has focused a lot on mentorship programs and kind of making sure that you're providing some type of mentor input for employees at all different levels. But ultimately, I think what really moves the needle on this topic is sponsorship. And I think of sponsorship as essentially somebody within your organization who is advocating for you or your career as opportunities come up for which you may not be in the room or be aware of. And so I do think it makes sense for organizations of sufficient size. Like, this doesn't really make sense in like a 20-person organization, but once you get to at least several hundred people, I think making sure that your most promising talent has that sponsorship and has the opportunity to be represented and to have people who are thinking about how you develop your talent in a broader way than may be obvious at the moment.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe someone who's sponsored you throughout your career, and then if you're looking to sponsor someone, what are some qualities you would look for within the organization?
Yep. So for me, I would say certainly while I was at Morningstar, I felt like I had a number of sponsors and just a great amount of support. And that has just been so instrumental to my background and kind of my development as a leader. And I think even to the extent where at the beginning I didn't even really know who my sponsors were, and you kind of figure it out through different conversations and the support that you're seeing from other leaders in the organization. In terms of sponsoring people proactively, I think it really is about looking for potential. Because people do tend to, in hiring decisions or promotion decisions, to overly focus on the evidence in front of them. And I think when you focus on potential, you're really thinking about what someone is capable of accomplishing as opposed to what they've already accomplished. And when you put that lens on it, I think you can really bring a new generation of talent and a new group of people in your organization to a level where they can contribute. And it does require, I think, mentorship as well, right? You can't just put somebody in a role who's not qualified for it. But if you can identify their potential to succeed and then give them the right support from a training, mentorship perspective, then I think that's really how you can take people's careers to the next level.
In your opening remarks, you mentioned confidence and humility and raising your hands. Was it your sponsors that helped you gain that confidence and pushed you into certain directions, or how did you kind of come to the terms of, I'm going to start having these conversations and raise my hand for different opportunities that come about?
That's a good question. I mean, I really think some of it is, it's just you learn over time where you can feel comfortable taking risks and where you feel like you'd rather take a back seat. And for me, I felt like, I had probably 4 different roles before I sort of ended up in this equity research role at Morningstar. And in those, I'd observed the leadership styles and just perspective that I gained from different leaders in different organizations. And so I kind of felt like I was starting to get a good sense of what good leadership looked like and what bad leadership looked like. We've all experienced both, I'm sure. And ultimately, I just felt like it was something that I had a growing passion that I really wanted to try. And so I think if Morningstar had not given me that opportunity, I probably would have sought it somewhere else. And so I don't know, for me it was a little bit of just having the right conversations with the right people. I will say though, from a humility perspective, when I was going through the interview process for my first job leading, a meaningful amount of people, like more than 2 people, in one of the interviews I said, well, I almost didn't apply for this job because I didn't think I was qualified. And one of the people I was interviewing with said, don't ever say that again. Don't doubt yourself, you have to go for it. And ultimately, everyone doubts themselves at some aspect of their role, and if you didn't, I think you'd be an insufferable person to be around. But it was helpful to kind of get that feedback at the time of, you have to believe it yourself. Like if you don't back yourself, it's very hard for someone else to back you. And you can still, I think, have that level of humility and be questioning how to constantly get better and add to your skill set without, necessarily having it mean that you believe you can do anything at that very moment. So,
in your bio, it mentions some of your involvement in various nonprofits, including Weld and Rock the Street. Can you talk about your experiences there and working with girls in high school and then women in leadership?
Yeah. So if you're not familiar with the organization Rock the Street, Wall Street, I wasn't familiar with it either until probably 2 years ago. They're basically trying to bring financial services related training and education to high school girls. And we partnered with them to bring Rock the Street, Wall Street to Columbus because they didn't have a presence there. And it was a really great opportunity to kind of work with some students and see how their program works. They have, I think, 8 or 10 classes where you participate in a class with the students and you are the teacher, basically. The volunteers are the teachers. And Rock the Street, Wall Street provides the curriculum. And then they have a mentorship program in the spring. And it was so amazing to find these women who are super interested in our industry, but literally know nothing about it. They don't have someone in their family that they can ask questions to, or they don't know somebody who's already in it, but yet they do have this interest in, finding some people that they can ask questions of and understanding where to go for more information, and some things that I think sound really, really basic, but if we weren't there providing that, I'm not sure they would have continued to pursue their interest in our industry. So I'm really hopeful that organizations like Rock the Street, Wall Street can really help us have a greater level of diversity coming into the industry than I think we all know we face today. Because I do think you have to start as early as possible, and this is true, kind of across STEM. There's a lot of research about the earlier you can expose young girls to the opportunity to kind of learn from some of the opportunities that there are across STEM careers. I think the more likely you are to see success. So, and Weld is an organization. I think it was founded in Ohio. I think it goes beyond Ohio, but I'm not actually sure. And it is essentially an organization that advocates for women leaders and board members, and they've actually kind of turned their focus to including different elements of ethnic diversity as well, especially on boards. And they're holding a forum in a couple of weeks to really try to increase the diversity of boards that I'm participating in, and I think will be really interesting. Yeah.
Got to start from the top.
Yeah.
I'm kind of moving to the fun questions. I don't know if you have anything else that you wanted to ask before we get to know Heather a little bit more. What advice would you give to your 25-year-old self?
That's a good one.
20, 25, somewhere in that range, younger self.
Well, I remember when I was that age, I took like one of those career quizzes where you're trying to figure out what you should be when you grow up. And it said that I should be a CEO or a politician. And And I was like, well, I'm definitely not going to be a politician. So, but seriously, I think that gave me some confidence that I could take on a leadership role. Like, oh, there must be something that I said in this quiz that, maybe being a CEO is not out of reach. But I still at that moment did not, you can't just go be a CEO, obviously. And so I'd say the advice that I sort of ended up following, that I would reiterate to myself maybe even a few years earlier, was develop an expertise in something you love doing. Because I do feel like, if you're pursuing something you're really passionate about, that will shine through. And it's so much easier to be successful and happy if you are doing something you love. And it's so interesting, I think, too, in this time that we're all living in and seeing the Great Resignation headlines and everything. I think people are really thinking a lot about that now and saying, if I don't love my day-to-day, what am I doing? And I need to find something I love. I feel very fortunate that I love investing, and I happened into it very early in my career because I was not someone who was, sitting around in high school making investment decisions. I really didn't know anything about investing until right after undergrad. So I do feel like kind of figuring out, finding the elements of what it is you love about what you do and amplifying those, I think, is really the best advice I could have given myself.
Very good advice.
Yeah, and it's great that now people don't just have different jobs, they end up having different careers. So if they haven't found that spark, they have the ability, and it's encouraged to find, your passion and follow your passion.
Absolutely.
So I don't know how you would have any free time with all the boards and you're involved with and being a CEO, but what do you like to do outside of the office? What are some of your hobbies and interests?
Well, probably my favorite hobby, if you could call it that, is hiking. I love anything from, like an hour hike on some hills, if you can call them that, in Ohio, to, last weekend I was in Denver and did like a 5-hour hike to a glacial lake that was just so beautiful. And so I really enjoy kind of seeing parts of the world through hiking. And about a decade ago, I did my first kind of like big destination hike where I went to Machu Picchu and hiked the Inca Trail. And it was the most amazing experience. And I had a personal connection because I'd studied Latin American history and politics in college, and I'd always wanted to go to Machu Picchu. So it made it particularly interesting to me. But doing it by hiking the Inca Trail as opposed to kind of taking the train and just seeing Machu Picchu made it so much more impactful.
If you haven't been to Hocking Hill, that's a good area outside of Columbus for hiking, about the best we have.
Yes.
Like otherwise flatlands, you're exactly right. You had sent us a PowerPoint presentation about some of the cognitive diversity things that we were focusing on, and there was a few books in there that you had read. You seem to like to read a lot. Is there any particular books that you've read recently or any ones that you would recommend?
One book I read probably 6 months ago or so that I think was one of the best I've come across from a leadership perspective in a while was called Unleashed, the Unapologetic Leader's Guide to Empowering Everyone Around You, or something like that. And it was so good on a number of levels. So I ended up having our whole leadership team read it, and we kind of had a book discussion around it. And I just think there were some really great insights in there about making sure that you are really just unlocking the potential of people, because I think everyone is so much more happy when they feel like they're really contributing at their highest level. And so the book has some really good ideas about how you actually do that. And I think it can be hard sometimes for people in management and leadership roles to sufficiently let go and let people succeed on their own, but also let them fail and learn from those mistakes and failures. And I think I just think that's a really important part of developing people. So that's a great one. On a personal or like a fiction level, I recently read The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna, and such a good book. It was just kind of set in the Dust Bowl, and it reminded me of reading The Grapes of Wrath back in high school. And I have a high schooler now, so he's probably on the verge of reading The Grapes of Wrath. So, but I love to read fiction and nonfiction, and so there's a couple examples.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, that was a great book, and you could really see the Four Winds. You could really see the struggles that people 100 years ago in our country faced.
Absolutely.
It makes working from home or the pandemic seem not that difficult after you read about the Dust Bowl.
Definitely.
So what is something that is left on your career bucket list?
That's a good question. So people often ask me, it seems like your career is so intentional. You're clearly, lining all of these things up in a very purposeful way. And that is definitely not true. I feel like, to some extent, I just keep moving in the direction of doing something I love doing. And I love my current role so much. I feel so fortunate to be in the situation that I'm in. And so, I could see myself doing it for the foreseeable future. I definitely would say I really enjoy helping other people develop and succeed. And so, to the extent that that can always be part of my future role, I definitely want it to be. I know some people really hate sitting on boards, and I don't hate it. I actually quite like it. I think it can be really strategic and give a very different perspective, and I always feel like I'm learning from the boards that I'm on in a way that helps me in my day-to-day as well. I spent about 7 years on the board of CFA Institute, and that is a very wide-reaching organization and also very geographically diverse, certainly. And I think I just learned so much from all of the experiences of being on that board that I feel like has really continued to propel my career and my ability to apply those learnings. So I don't know, I feel so fortunate. I feel very fulfilled in my current role that I hope I get to do it for a long time.
Did you find that the boards that you're on are cognitively diverse, or are they?
Yes, I would say certainly CFA Institute was probably the most cognitively diverse board I've ever been part of. And it's interesting because when I joined the board, there were very few women on it. There were 18 or 19 people on the board, and I think there was one other woman. And but there was a ton of geographic diversity, people from all over the world with very different perspectives from different parts of the industry. And so we set a goal while I was on the board to get to 30% women by 5 years from then. And we exceeded that goal, and it just to me said how important it can be to figure out what are the elements of diversity that you think you could benefit from. And only 17 or 18% of CFA charter holders are female, and we really want to change that. And certainly the organization had put a lot of effort into thinking about why is that the case and how do we have an impact on that over time. And so I think by purposely making sure we had a really gender diverse board, we really tried to show what a priority we thought that was and get more perspectives from women who were charter holders in the industry and how we could continue to enhance that opportunity. So.
I don't know if you have any more questions. Okay. Well, we've got a few more minutes, but I think everybody's probably hungry, and I'm sure we really appreciate your time. This was excellent. We learned a lot, and we can't thank you enough for presenting with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.